It was supposed to be just another Saturday, one of those easygoing days where the humdrum of routine fills the hours. I had my plan laid out, nothing fancy, just a morning spent tinkering with the old car and finishing up a few house chores I'd been putting off. Saturdays were my days, a chance to unwind, get my hands dirty, and not think too much about anything. The garage was my sanctuary, the place where the outside world didn't matter. It smelled like motor oil and a faint trace of cleaner from my last scrub-down session. I liked it that way. The low murmur of the radio played in the background, barely loud enough to hear the lyrics, blending into the steady rhythm of the wrench in my hand. Every bolt I turned felt like a small victory, a piece of control in an otherwise chaotic world. Sarah poked her head into the garage a few times that morning, coffee mug in hand, her perfume trailing behind her. It was light and floral, the kind that lingered even after she left the room. "You're making progress," she said with a smile before disappearing again. It wasn't unusual. Sarah always had her own plans on Saturdays, usually meeting friends for brunch or catching up on errands. She'd mention them casually, and I'd nod without much thought, engrossed in my tasks. But that day, there was something different. Maybe it was the way her voice sounded just a little more cheerful than usual, or how her perfume seemed heavier, clinging to the air longer than it should. Maybe it was nothing. I didn't dwell on it then. I had brake pads to replace and a car that was determined to keep me busy. Around noon, she came in again, and this time, I noticed. She wasn't dressed in her usual Saturday casual, the comfy jeans and oversized sweater she loved to lounge around in. Instead, she wore a beige dress that hugged her figure in a way that made me look twice, paired with elegant sandals that clicked softly against the garage floor. Her hair was done too. Not in the messy ponytail she threw up when she was in a hurry, but carefully styled, like she had spent extra time in front of the mirror. She looked polished, too polished for an afternoon with Claire. I paused, wrench in hand, and gave her a once-over. "You look nice," I said, keeping my tone neutral. I thought maybe I was overthinking it. After all, women dress up sometimes. It didn't have to mean anything, but her smile was quick, almost fleeting, and when she kissed me on the cheek, her eyes didn't quite meet mine. "Don't wait for me for dinner," she said. "We might stay out late." There was something about the way she said it. Casual, like it didn't matter, like I shouldn't think too hard about it. And maybe I wouldn't have, if it weren't for the way the air shifted when she left. The garage felt quieter, heavier, like her absence had taken more than just her physical presence. I shook it off, convincing myself it was all in my head. People dress up, I thought. Maybe Claire had booked a nice restaurant for lunch. Women like that kind of thing. By the time I finished tightening the last bolt on the brake caliper and poured the new fluid, Sarah was gone. I tested the pedal and cleaned up, but my mind wasn't fully in it anymore. I caught myself thinking about that dress, those sandals, and the way she'd told me not to wait for her. It was probably nothing, I told myself, but it lingered. Looking back, I think that was the moment the first crack appeared. Small, almost invisible, the kind of thing you only notice when it's too late. At the time, I didn't see it for what it was. I didn't realize it was the beginning of something that would unravel everything. I just thought it was another Saturday. If only it had stayed that way. By Sunday morning, I should have been shaking off whatever weird feeling I had about Sarah's polished look and her late-night outing. After all, it wasn't the first time she'd gone out with Claire and come home late. But something about it stuck. It wasn't jealousy. I didn't have a jealous bone in my body. It was a gnawing sense of inconsistency. Like there were pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was trying to put together. Sarah was still in bed, sleeping like she hadn't a care in the world, while I decided to tackle the laundry. It was a mindless task, one I actually enjoyed because it let me zone out. I sorted through the pile, t-shirts, jeans, Sarah's blouses, until my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. It was smooth and cool, and when I pulled it out, I was staring at a black silk tie. I frowned. It wasn't mine. I didn't even own a tie like that. My work didn't call for it, and I certainly wasn't the type to wear something that expensive. Turning it over in my hands, I looked for some kind of clue, a brand tag, initials, anything to explain how it ended up in my house. But there was nothing. It was pristine, the kind of thing you wear with a tailored suit to a high-end event. It felt out of place in my world, like an intruder that didn't belong. At first, I told myself it was probably something innocent. Maybe it was left behind by a guest months ago at a party I'd forgotten about. Or maybe Sarah had borrowed it for some reason. She did help Claire with event planning sometimes. Maybe it ended up in her bag by accident. Logical, harmless explanations. That's what I clung to. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I hung the tie on the edge of the laundry room cabinet, where it wouldn't be forgotten, and walked away. It didn't feel worth confronting her about. Not yet. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions or make accusations over something so trivial. But every time I passed that tie, it was like it was staring at me, a silent reminder that I didn't have an answer. That evening, Sarah came home. She seemed content, almost glowing, like someone who'd spent the day being pampered. She kissed me on the cheek and flopped onto the couch with her phone, scrolling aimlessly while I flipped through channels. The tie was still nagging at me, so I decided to bring it up, casually, like it had just crossed my mind. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice light. "Do you know where that tie came from? The one in the laundry?" Her eyes flicked toward the laundry room, and for the briefest moment, I saw something, a hesitation, a flicker of tension. But then she laughed. It was light, easy, almost too easy. "Oh, that's James's," she said smoothly. "We were helping him get ready for his anniversary party last week. I must have thrown it in my bag by mistake." Her answer was quick, almost practiced, but it made sense. James was a friend of ours, the kind of guy who'd wear a tie like that. It checked out. And yet, something about her tone didn't feel right. I nodded, letting it go. "Makes sense," I said, keeping my voice even. But as she turned back to her phone, the image of that brief hesitation stayed with me, like a door she'd almost closed but didn't latch. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The tie, her explanation, the way her laugh had been just a little too light, her words just a little too polished. It wasn't enough to accuse her of anything, but it was enough to plant a seed. It's strange how something so small can hold so much weight. A tie, just a strip of fabric. But it wasn't just the tie. It was the questions it raised, questions I didn't even realize I was asking. Looking back, I wonder if I was already unraveling the thread that would eventually tear everything apart. At the time, though, I told myself to let it go. Trust her. Trust us. But trust is a fragile thing, isn't it? Once there's a crack, no matter how small, you can't help but notice it every time you look. And cracks? They only get bigger if you ignore them. By the following weekend, I had convinced myself to let the tie incident go. Sarah had given me an explanation, and I had no real reason to doubt her. I kept telling myself I was overthinking, stringing together unrelated moments to create a story that didn't exist. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, the unease lingered. It didn't help that other small things started to add up. Her phone, which used to be left face up on the counter, was now always face down. She started staying out later, often claiming last-minute plans with Claire. When I asked about her day, her answers were polished but brief, almost like she was reading from a script. And then there were the gym trips, extra sessions on weekdays and spontaneous workouts on weekends. When I offered to join her, she laughed and brushed me off, saying, "It's my alone time." None of it was damning on its own. A tie, a phone face down, a few extra gym visits. But together, they started forming a picture, blurry but unmistakable. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but I wasn't blind either. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided I needed clarity, real, undeniable clarity. If I was going to confront her, I couldn't go in with vague suspicions. I needed proof. Cold, hard evidence. So, I started small, testing the waters. One evening, Sarah told me she'd be out with Claire for dinner at a restaurant they frequented. It sounded routine enough, but I decided to call her about 45 minutes after she left. I kept my voice casual, pretending to need her help. "Hey, Sarah," I said, keeping it light. "Sorry to bother you, but I can't find the kitchen renovation contract. Do you remember where it is?" There was a pause, just long enough to make me wonder if I'd caught her off guard. Then her tone softened, steady as always. "Oh, it's in the blue folder in the hallway drawer." You must have missed it." Her answer was quick and confident, but I wasn't listening to her words. I was listening to the background noise, the hum of conversations, the occasional clink of glass, and soft music. It sounded like a restaurant, exactly where she said she'd be. Everything seemed to check out, but just as I was about to hang up, I heard it, a faint male voice in the background. "Hey, Sarah, everything okay?" It wasn't loud or overly familiar, but something about it stuck with me. Who was that? A waiter? Another diner? Or someone else? I didn't press her. I thanked her and ended the call, telling myself I was imagining things. But the voice lingered, gnawing at me. The next day, I decided to take things a step further. I had an old GPS tracker from a road trip, small and discreet. While Sarah was in the shower, I slipped it into the trunk of her car, hidden under the carpet. It linked to an app on my phone, and I could track her movements in real time. That evening, when Sarah left for another dinner with Claire, I opened the app and watched. At first, everything seemed normal. She drove directly to the restaurant they often visited, and the car stayed there for about 2 hours. But then, just as I started to relax, the tracker showed her car moving again. This time, the route was different. She was heading toward a quiet residential area. My pulse quickened as I watched the blinking on the screen. It wasn't near any restaurants, shops, or landmarks. It was out of the way, a place with no obvious reason for her to be there. When she came home later that night, I tried to act casual. "How was dinner? Did you stop anywhere else afterward?" I asked, watching her closely. She smiled, calm as ever. "Oh yes, Tara forgot her phone at the restaurant, so we had to circle around the neighborhood looking for it. Can you imagine? 10 minutes of driving in circles before we found it." Her explanation was flawless, matching the route I'd seen on the tracker. Every stop, every turn. It all added up. And yet, it didn't. Something in her tone felt rehearsed, perfectly polished, like she had anticipated the question. By now, I couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at me. Sarah was hiding something. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was there. The little inconsistencies, the vague explanations, the subtle changes in her behavior. They were like threads unraveling a fabric I hadn't even realized was fraying. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. If I was wrong, I'd destroy something that might still be whole. But if I was right, I needed to know. By this point, I felt like I was living 2 lives. Outwardly, I was the same husband Sarah had always known. Supportive, calm, and engaged in our routines. But beneath the surface, I was a man on a mission, quietly gathering the puzzle pieces that were beginning to show me a picture I didn't want to see. I doubled down on my investigations. The tracker was already in place, but I needed more. So, one morning while Sarah was in the shower, I slipped a small camera into the dashboard of her car. It was discreet, tucked into the plastic lining, and linked to my phone for live streaming. If she was hiding something, I was determined to find it. That evening, Sarah mentioned another dinner with Claire. I nodded, pretending to be uninterested, while my mind raced. As soon as she left, I opened the app to watch her movements. Just like before, she drove straight to the restaurant, parked, and stayed there for about an hour. Nothing unusual, at least not yet. But then, just as I had suspected, the tracker showed her car moving again. This time, it wasn't heading home. It was taking a familiar path toward the quiet residential area I had seen before. My heart sank as I watched the blinking dot come to a stop. I zoomed in on the map. It was a single house, large and secluded, with a long driveway. I switched to the camera feed and waited. A few minutes later, the passenger door opened, and a man got in. He was tall, sharply dressed, and exuded a smug confidence that made my blood boil. His face was partially obscured by the low light, but I didn't need a full view to know. This was Daniel. Their conversation was muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Sarah's voice was soft, almost shy, while Daniel's carried the kind of familiarity that cut me to the core. Then it happened. She leaned toward him, and he met her halfway. The kiss was brief but devastating. My stomach churned as I watched her pull back, her expression glowing with a warmth I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I stopped the feed and sat in silence, my phone still in my hand. The evidence was undeniable now. This wasn't my imagination, And it wasn't paranoia. Sarah was having an affair. She had chosen him, chosen deceit, over the life we had built together. Still, I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Confronting her now would lead to denials, excuses, and maybe even gaslighting. No, I needed more. I needed something she couldn't wiggle out of, something that would strip away the mask she had so carefully constructed. The next day, I took it a step further. I called in a favor from my friend Ethan, who had access to small surveillance devices through his work. He handed me a tiny audio recorder that could fit into the palm of my hand. "Whatever you're looking for," he said, "this will give you clarity." I slipped the recorder into Sarah's favorite purse, a bag she always took with her on these outings. It was a risk, but a calculated one. If she was truly hiding something, I'd hear it. That evening, when she left again, I waited. Hours later, as I sat in the garage replaying the recording, the last shred of doubt evaporated. The recorder had picked up everything: the laughter, the murmured endearments, and the way she called him Danny. But what struck me the hardest was how she spoke about me. "I feel alive with you," she whispered. "With Mark, it's just routine. I don't even think he notices me anymore." Her words felt like a dagger, twisting with every syllable. Routine? I had spent years building a life with her, years loving her, and she reduced it to routine. Worse, she blamed me for it, as if I had driven her into the arms of another man. The audacity of it made my blood boil. But the final blow came when Daniel laughed and said, "You could just leave him, you know. He'd never see it coming." And Sarah replied, "It's not that simple. This is easier." Easier. Betrayal, deceit, and lies were easier than honesty. That's when something in me snapped. I wasn't going to let this continue, and I wasn't going to let her humiliate me further. But I wasn't going to act impulsively. No, I needed a plan, something meticulous, something she wouldn't see coming. The evidence was mounting, the picture becoming clearer with every passing day. But for now, I kept my cards close to my chest, waiting for the right moment to play my hand. It was just supposed to be a small gathering, a casual night with Sarah's friends, or so she claimed. When she told me about it, I played along, nodding and offering to help set up. Inside, I was seething. The evidence I'd gathered had painted a crystal-clear picture of her betrayal. But this was something different. She was bringing them into my home, our home, and I knew Daniel would be among them. She had no idea I was watching her so closely, no idea her lies were crumbling right in front of me. The day of the gathering, I went about preparing the house, keeping my composure. I set up the drinks table, made small talk with Sarah about the food, and even arranged chairs on the patio. All the while, I felt like a bomb ticking toward detonation. Sarah, meanwhile, was radiant, her confidence palpable as she floated through the house, humming to herself. She had no clue what was coming. By the time the guests started arriving, I had to remind myself to breathe. Claire arrived first, greeting Sarah with the kind of exaggerated enthusiasm you'd expect from an old friend. Then came a few others from Sarah's circle, people I barely knew but recognized from her stories. And then he walked in. Daniel. He strolled in with the kind of smug confidence that made me want to knock him flat right there in the doorway. He wasn't flashy, but he didn't need to be. He carried himself like a man who thought he'd won something, someone who believed he was untouchable. He glanced at me briefly, offered a polite hello, and then turned his full attention to Sarah. She lit up the moment she saw him, her smile a little too wide, her laugh a little too easy. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to stay calm. The night unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck. Sarah flitted between guests, her charm on full display, but her focus always drifted back to Daniel. I watched as they exchanged subtle glances, as her hand lingered on his arm a little too long when she passed him a drink. It was nauseating. My friends were in my house, laughing and chatting like everything was normal, completely unaware of the farce playing out before their eyes. As the night wore on, Sarah's confidence grew, and with it, her cruelty. She made little jabs at me throughout the evening, laughing as she told a story about me fumbling through a DIY project or forgetting an anniversary years ago. Normally, I'd laugh along, not wanting to seem thin-skinned, but tonight, it felt different. The laughter wasn't playful, it was mocking. At one point, Daniel chimed in, adding his own sarcastic comment about how every handyman needs supervision. The group erupted in laughter, and I felt my fists tighten. I caught Sarah looking at him, her eyes sparkling with approval. It wasn't just me she was mocking. It was us, the life we had built together. Then it happened. I had been standing by the kitchen counter, pouring myself a drink, when Sarah walked over, drink in hand. She was already laughing at something Daniel had said, her face flushed with excitement. I tried to step away, but she caught me by the arm and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, don't be so uptight, Mark. It's just a joke." I didn't say anything. I couldn't trust myself to speak, but the silence must have irked her because she suddenly turned on me, her tone sharp. "See? This is what I'm talking about. He never knows how to take a joke. Always so serious." The group laughed, and Daniel's voice rang out above the rest. "Come on, Sarah. Maybe he's just tired of playing house." I froze. It was the kind of insult meant to sting, and it hit its mark. But before I could respond, Sarah did something I'll never forget. She spat at me. Right there, in front of everyone. It wasn't a casual mistake or a drunken misstep. It was deliberate, calculated, and humiliating. For a moment, the room fell silent, the laughter evaporating as everyone waited to see what I would do. Daniel, of course, laughed. A smug, condescending chuckle that pushed me over the edge. I turned toward him, my vision narrowing, and before I knew what I was doing, my fist connected with his jaw. The crack was loud, and his tooth flew across the room, landing somewhere near the drinks table. He staggered back, clutching his mouth, his face a mix of shock and pain. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice low but steady. My eyes locked with Sarah's, and for the first time that night, she looked scared. Not angry, not defiant, scared. The guests stood frozen, unsure of what to do, until I pointed toward the door. "The party's over. Leave." One by one, they shuffled out, their heads down, murmuring awkward apologies. Daniel was the last to go, still clutching his jaw, blood staining his shirt. Sarah stayed behind, standing in the wreckage of her humiliation and betrayal. For the first time, she was completely exposed, her carefully crafted image shattered. As the door clicked shut behind the last guest, I turned to her. "You humiliated me for the last time, Sarah," I said, my voice cold. Then I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there alone. The morning after the party, the house was unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and forces you to confront what just happened. I woke up in the guest room, the bed foreign and cold, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to the room I used to share with Sarah. That space felt tainted now, a graveyard for whatever love we had left. I didn't hear Sarah stirring upstairs. Maybe she was awake, but too ashamed to come down. Or maybe she was still asleep, lost in whatever version of reality she'd spun to justify what she'd done. Either way, I didn't care. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the wild, fiery way I had been when I hit Daniel. That rage had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder, sharper. A clarity I hadn't had before. She had spit on me, laughed at me, mocked me in front of her lover and her so-called friends. And for what? To prove a point? To feel powerful? The humiliation wasn't just public. It was personal. It had taken everything I had not to lash out further, to keep my composure while my marriage crumbled in front of an audience. But now the audience was gone, and it was just me and the wreckage. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, staring out the window as if the answers to all my questions might be hidden in the gray clouds outside. How had we gotten here? How had I missed the signs for so long? And most importantly, what was I going to do next? The first thing I did was call my lawyer. Sarah hadn't come downstairs yet, but I wasn't waiting for her to make the next move. This wasn't just about leaving her. It was about protecting myself. I wasn't going to let her take the house, my savings, or anything else I'd worked for. I explained the situation to my lawyer, Lucas, leaving out no details. He listened quietly, and when I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This isn't just a divorce case," Lucas finally said. "This is a battle, and you're holding all the weapons." He wasn't wrong. I had the recordings, the texts, the GPS logs, and now, witnesses to her betrayal and humiliation. I didn't need to lie or embellish. The truth was damning enough. Lucas assured me he'd get the ball rolling immediately, starting with freezing our joint accounts. She won't see it coming, he said, his tone almost amused. And she won't be able to touch a dime of what's yours. The satisfaction I felt at those words was brief. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about standing up for myself after being trampled on for far too long. Still, I couldn't deny the grim satisfaction of knowing that Sarah, who had spent the last year building her little fantasy with Daniel, was about to have her reality shattered. Later that day, Sarah finally came downstairs. She looked like a ghost of herself. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale, and her eyes rimmed red. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of coffee. "Mark," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know where to start." "Don't," I said, cutting her off. My tone was cold, detached. "I don't want to hear it. Not now, not ever." She flinched, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she took a deep breath and tried again. "I messed up. I know I did. But please, we can fix this." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Fix this? You think this can be fixed? You spit on me, Sarah. You laughed at me with him. And now you want to fix it?" Her lip quivered, but I didn't stop. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. You destroyed our marriage, not with one mistake, but with months of lies. And now, because you're finally facing the consequences, you want forgiveness? No, Sarah, you don't get to ask for that." She stared at me, stunned into silence. For once, she didn't have a polished response or a clever excuse. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "Your access to our accounts has been frozen. You won't be touching another dime of my money. I'm filing for divorce, and I have more than enough evidence to make sure you walk away with nothing." Her face crumbled at those words. "Mark, please," she begged, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We can go to counseling, we can." I stood up, cutting her off again. "We're done, Sarah. Pack your things. I want you out of this house by the end of the week." She sobbed openly then, her pleas dissolving into incoherent apologies. But I didn't care. I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there at the table, alone with the weight of what she had done. That night, I slept in the guest room again, but this time, it felt different. The coldness of the bed didn't bother me. The silence of the house didn't feel oppressive. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. Sarah's betrayal had broken something in me, but it hadn't destroyed me. And now, it was my turn to rebuild. The morning after Sarah's tears failed to move me, I began the next phase of my plan. There was no point in dragging this out, or letting her think there was still hope for reconciliation. I had already lost enough time, dignity, and trust. Now it was about securing my future and ensuring that she faced the consequences of her actions. Lucas, my lawyer, wasted no time. By the end of the day, all our joint accounts were frozen, leaving Sarah unable to touch another penny. I had also begun separating my personal finances, ensuring that what was mine would stay mine. Lucas was a shark, calculated, relentless, and exactly what I needed. His first move was to draft the divorce papers, highlighting Sarah's infidelity and citing every piece of evidence I'd collected. In our state, adultery still carried weight in divorce proceedings, and I had plenty to back up my case. "Mark," Lucas said during a meeting, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, "you're walking out of this clean. The house, the assets, even her alimony claim. It's all going to you. She won't have a leg to stand on." I nodded, the satisfaction muted. I wasn't looking for revenge, not entirely. I just wanted justice. Sarah had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences. But Lucas wasn't done. "There's one more thing," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "We should make sure the evidence is entered into the public record. Once it's filed, anyone, including her employer, can see the details." The weight of his suggestion hung in the air. Exposing Sarah's affair would not only devastate her personally, but could also ruin her professionally. Part of me hesitated. Was it too far? But then I thought about the way she had laughed at me, the way she had spat on me in front of her lover and her friends. No, this wasn't too far. This was accountability. Within days, the papers were filed, and Sarah was served. The look on her face when she opened the envelope was a mix of disbelief and desperation. She confronted me later that evening, waving the papers in her hand. "You're really doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "After everything we've been through?" I looked at her, calm and unflinching. "Yes, Sarah. After everything you've done, I'm doing this." She tried to argue, to plead, but her words held no weight anymore. I walked away, letting her stew in the reality she had created. But the fallout wasn't limited to our home. Lucas had ensured that the evidence made its way to Sarah's employer, a high-profile company with a strict code of conduct. Within a week, Sarah was called into a meeting with the HR department. I didn't know the details of what was said, but I knew the outcome: indefinite suspension pending an internal review. In the corporate world, that was as good as a termination. Her professional life was crumbling, just like her personal one. Daniel didn't escape unscathed, either. Lucas had sent the evidence to his company as well, and the response was swift. As a senior executive, his behavior was deemed a gross violation of company policy. He was terminated effective immediately, escorted out of the building with nothing but a box of his personal belongings. The man who had smugly laughed in my face was now jobless and humiliated. The whispers started soon after. Our social circle wasn't large, and word spread quickly. Friends who had once fawned over Sarah now avoided her calls. Colleagues distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with her scandal. The carefully curated image she had built over the years was disintegrating, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The court hearing was the final blow. Lucas presented the evidence meticulously, leaving no room for doubt. The judge's verdict was decisive. The house, the joint assets, and the savings accounts were all awarded to me. Sarah's alimony claim was denied, and she was ordered to cover all legal fees. By the time the hearing ended, she looked like a shell of the confident woman she had once been. As we left the courtroom, she approached me one last time, tears streaming down her face. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to end like this." I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "It ended the moment you chose him over us, Sarah. Now, you live with that choice." I walked away, leaving her standing there alone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. Sarah's betrayal had been a storm, but I had weathered it. And now, as I stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, I knew I was free. By the time the dust began to settle, Sarah's world had completely unraveled. The confident, polished woman who once commanded attention at every dinner party and work event was now a shadow of her former self. The fallout of her choices was swift and brutal, and there was no escaping it. Her suspension from work turned into a formal termination within 2 weeks. The company conducted a thorough internal review, and the evidence I had provided, messages, recordings, and even witness accounts from the party, made its way into their hands. For a firm that prided itself on professionalism and integrity, Sarah's actions were an unforgivable stain. The HR department's decision was final. She was let go without severance. The whispers among her colleagues turned into outright avoidance. Her reputation in the corporate world was shattered, making it nearly impossible for her to find new opportunities. Daniel wasn't faring any better. His termination was public knowledge within his industry, and the details of his affair with Sarah quickly became the subject of gossip. People whispered about how the once respected executive had been caught sneaking around with a married woman, how he'd lost his job, and how his smug confidence had been replaced by shame. His colleagues, once loyal and friendly, now treated him like a cautionary tale. His professional network dried up, leaving him isolated and humiliated. The social circles that Sarah had carefully cultivated were equally unforgiving. Friends who had once admired her charm and elegance now avoided her entirely. Invitations to brunches, charity events, and dinners disappeared overnight. The same people who had laughed with her at my expense during that fateful party now whispered behind her back, sharing stories of her downfall with a mix of pity and disdain. No one wanted to be associated with her scandal. It wasn't just the whispers and the lost invitations that stung her. It was the outright rejection from people she had considered her closest allies. Claire, her supposed best friend, cut all ties, claiming she couldn't condone Sarah's behavior. Others followed suit, quietly distancing themselves until Sarah was left standing alone in the wreckage of her reputation. I heard about her struggles through mutual acquaintances. She tried to apply for new jobs, but every time her name came up, so did the details of her affair and the court proceedings. In today's digital age, nothing stays hidden. The evidence Lucas and I had presented in court was public record, accessible to anyone curious enough to search. Employers, neighbors, and even strangers could read the transcripts, listen to the recordings, and see the messages that exposed her deceit. One acquaintance told me Sarah had started selling her designer clothes and handbags online to make ends meet. Another mentioned seeing her at a coffee shop, looking disheveled and distracted, scrolling through job listings on her laptop. The once impeccable Sarah, who used to glide into rooms with an air of confidence, now moved through the world with her head down, trying to avoid the judgmental eyes of the people around her. But the consequences weren't just external. The betrayal and humiliation she had inflicted on me had also turned inward. She began questioning her choices, wondering how she had let her life spiral so far out of control. Mutual friends told me she spoke about regret, about how she had thrown away a stable, loving marriage for a fleeting affair with a man who couldn't even face her after the fallout. Daniel, it seemed, had disappeared from her life entirely, unwilling to share in the consequences of their actions. Despite the stories I heard, I didn't feel pity for her. She had made her choices. She had humiliated me, betrayed me, and destroyed the life we had built together. The consequences she was now facing were of her own making, and I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. One day, she showed up at the house. It was a cold, gray afternoon, and I saw her standing on the porch through the front window. She was clutching a small suitcase, her face pale and tear-streaked. For a moment, I considered ignoring her, letting her stand there in the cold. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door. "Mark," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know where to go. I don't have anything left." I looked at her, letting the silence stretch between us. There was no anger in me anymore, no bitterness, just a cold resolve. "You made your choice, Sarah," I said finally, "and now you live with it." Her lip quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might argue or beg. But instead, she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I shut the door without another word, the sound of the latch clicking into place feeling like the final punctuation mark on a story I never wanted to write. As I watched her walk away, suitcase in hand, I felt no triumph. There was no joy in watching someone self-destruct, even someone who had hurt me as deeply as Sarah had. But there was peace. Peace in knowing that I had stood up for myself, that I had reclaimed my dignity in my life. And that, above all, was enough. The days after Sarah's departure were eerily quiet, but they weren't empty. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of my life shift in a way that wasn't crushing. It was freeing. The house, once a battlefield of unspoken tension and betrayal, now felt like mine again. Every room, every piece of furniture seemed to breathe differently, as if relieved to be rid of the turmoil. Rebuilding wasn't easy. There were moments when I would catch myself staring at the empty spot where her shoes used to be by the door, or the closet that now seemed too spacious. Grief, I realized, wasn't just for lost love. It was for lost illusions, for the person I thought she was, and for the life I thought we had. But grief, I learned, didn't have to consume me. It could shape me, mold me into someone stronger, someone more aware. The community whispers eventually quieted, and while Sarah became a ghost of her former self, avoided, forgotten, I began reclaiming my life. I reconnected with old friends, poured myself into hobbies I had neglected, and slowly, piece by piece, rediscovered who I was outside of our marriage. It was a process, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. One morning, as I sipped my coffee at the kitchen table, a sense of calm washed over me. The storm was over. The betrayal, the humiliation, the anger. It was all behind me now. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And in that quiet moment, I realized something. I had been broken, but I had rebuilt. And the foundation I was building now was unshakable. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. And that was more than enough.